Hello, gentle listener, and welcome to Nocturnal Transmissions, the fortnightly podcast that brings you dark tales, both old and new, performed by your humble narrator, Kristin Holland. Now, before we get to our oft-practiced indulgence of rollicking in mayhem and delighting in the misfortune of others, which we most certainly shall be doing today, I'd like to extend a big welcome to our new Patreon subscriber acolytes, those delightful darklings desirous of additional dread, whose co-conspiratorial contributions collectively contrive our dark flames. Continuance. Where was I? Oh yes, our newest acolytes. Scalby Lorsus Jim, Joanne Brooker, Boxen Wolf, Anther Lonely Heart, Dylan Slusher, Tanya Kay, Jeremiah Overstreet, Patrick Megan, Alejandro Franceschi, MJ Van Steenberg, Samantha Sorensen, Matthew Smith-Deal, Abby Livingston, and Pamela Macmillan. Welcome, my dears, welcome. And now, Nocturnal Transmissions is proud to present Joe Palumbo's Insectivorous. It was the feeling he was really missing, not the actual places or the people, he discovered to his surprise. He realized after spending an hour at his high school reunion that what he really was missing was the feeling that came when he would revisit those times in his mind. Alvin found as he walked the floor of the Black Hollow High gym, the feeling would come, but then would drift away just as he would attempt to capture it, like trying to catch smoke in your hand. However, sitting now in the back of Sharon's rented Jeep and bouncing down the dark back roads of Black Lake Park, the feeling was not only returning, but was remaining. His gaze glided through the dim interior of the vehicle, and as it did, the smoke became a fog that was now comfortably surrounding him. He smirked as, in his mind, the adults around him regressed to the group he once knew. He sat in the back driver, so he first saw the back of Sharon's head as he looked around. She was once the captain of the Black Hollow High debate team 20 years ago, and was now a successful trial lawyer for a law firm in Chicago. And, as she had put it back at the gym, "I was a wife and lawyer, now I am just a lawyer. And in another 2 years I can say partner." She had then given Maggie a high five that confused Alvin, but the two had kept in touch over the years, and he assumed it to be a joke, not for him. Maggie Kay, who was now known as Dr. Maggie Walden, sat in the passenger seat and chatted happily with Sharon. Alvin was glad to hear that she was not only a veterinarian now, a dream that was announced as she had crossed the graduation stage, but had just celebrated her 2-year wedding anniversary to a detective for the OKC police. Next to him was his closest friend from those times, and the one that stung the most when he thought of the void that time and distance had made between them. Danny Darling, a name that acted like a magnet for the ire of the larger kids of the school, forcing Danny to build an armor of strength around him. Alvin was glad that he had used that strength to shield himself from them without becoming cold and angry. He watched as his friend flipped through a worn paperback. He could see his own name in the dim light at the bottom of the cover. Alvin Page, and at the top, in large red letters, was the title, Evil Sleep. "Check this out," Danny said, and handed the book to Charles and Kate Vance, who were sitting in the very back. "My famous writer friend signed his first book for me." Danny reached into a front pocket of his leather jacket and produced a plastic tube. The top made an audible pop noise when he flipped it open with his thumb. He tipped up the tube to his mouth as if he was going to eat from it, and with the flourish of a magician doing a trick, removed the tube from his lips and revealed a pre-roll clutched between his teeth. The jeep was soon filled with the sharp smell of marijuana. "Don't light that in here," Sharon said, looking at Danny through the rear-view mirror. "Calm down, counselor," Danny said, lighting his smoke with a plastic lighter. "It's mine, and it's legal." He rolled down the window, pulling the smoke out. "And it's from my own shop," he said, extending the pre-roll to Alvin. "I'll be opening a third location in a month." Alvin, still feeling pleasantly stoned from the one that Danny had offered earlier in the men's room of the gym, accepted. As he blew the smoke out his own cracked window, he felt a tap on his shoulder from Charles Vance. Charles quickly gestured for the smoke, and Alvin, with a smirk, passed it. "Well," Sharon said with a conceit that was the most hated kind, the kind that was deserved, "I'm fairly sure smoking it in public is not legal." "Watch," Danny said, whispering to Alvin. 10 seconds after we get there, she'll be sniffing around for some." As if expecting it, Danny took the now much shorter pre-roll from the hand that was returning it from the back without breaking eye contact with Alvin. With a chuckle, Alvin shook his head and glanced back at Charles and his wife, Kate. She gave him a smile and small wave that he returned. He realized only now that they were the only ones who had not broken free from the small town pull of Black Hollow. The rest had all become rogue comets and broken free to spaces unexplored, but these two high school sweethearts had merged into one planetary body, forever held in orbit. Alvin bit his tongue and looked out the window. He watched the dark trees race by in a steady blur and tossed the analogy around in his mind. He liked it and decided to file it away in his mind for later use. "You should get with Kate and me on a book signing," Charles said. "I think it would go over really well for both. Hometown author does book signing at locally owned bookstore," Charles said as if reading a headline. "That's not a bad idea," Alvin said, with sincerity. Sharon brought the jeep to a stop in the middle of the narrow road. "I am starting to doubt I remember where it was," Kate said. "I thought the sign for it was usually hanging from the bottom of the thorn one." Sharon snapped her fingers in realization. "You're right. Must have fallen off or something. But I do remember that it was a little past the thorn campgrounds." She laughed and released the brake. Alvin looked up through the sunroof at the sky that had now turned a deep purple with the retreating sun. Shifting towards the side window, he was greeted with a much different view. Night had taken the offensive and had already invaded the woods that were around them and that surrounded the entirety of the park. Danny nudged him, and Alvin saw he was being offered the last of the pre-roll. He grinned and took it, and enjoyed the last of it in 2 long drags. "I bet you're glad I talked you into coming," Danny said. "Yes, I am," Alvin said, licking his thumb and index finger and using the damp digits to snuff out the glowing tip. He was glad that he had been approached in that men's room, he thought with an internal laugh. Alvin had entered that small and damp-smelling restroom to relieve himself after deciding to leave. He had tried for hours to catch that feeling, but dancing with smoke had left him with nothing to show for it. He was frustrated and ready to leave and drive straight back to Denver and Megan. He decided, washing his hands with the same pink soap he had 15 years earlier, that after the drive he would ask her to marry him, and then be done with the past. He would go cold turkey and break his addiction to nostalgia. That was until Danny had entered. "Don't leave now," he said, offering his smoke. "I know what you're thinking. None of us are really enjoying this anyway. So I have this idea." "What's that?" Alvin had asked while attempting to hold his breath. "Remember Buck's Point?" "Yeah," he said, nodding. "That little clearing out at the park by one of the lakes, but the smaller ones, not the ones that everyone loves." Alvin was trying to remember the name, but he had not thought of Black Hollow in close to 10 years. "Sharon said that she had grabbed a few six-packs on the way here. They're in the back of that big-ass Jeep she rented. She was saying that we should go to her hotel or whatever and hang, just as the gang, like we used to." "Well, that's not a bad idea, but—" Alvin said, shaking his head. "But," Danny said, hijacking Alvin's sentence, "there is a better place. Buck's Point." Alvin grinned at the idea, both in the restroom and in the Jeep. He had not seen Buck's Point since graduation night. Danny had mentioned that very thought, while also reminding him that this reunion was on the same day as their graduation. He had called it fate. When Alvin pointed out that graduation had been at the end of May, not the middle of April, Danny had countered with a shrug. That shrug was enough to talk him into it. Sharon had become more confident in the direction she was going, and with that naturally came speed. The trees around them became a black and green blur as they sped past. On their right, a large sign pointing to the entrance of the Thorn campgrounds flew by. Sharon looked at the shrinking sign in her side-view mirror. Alvin leaned forward so he could see out the windshield. He pointed to a gravel turnoff approaching on the left side of the road. "I see it," Sharon said quietly. "There isn't a sign, though." "I know that's it," Kate said, with a twinge of confusion in her voice. Sharon pulled over onto the gravel patch, and everyone piled out. Danny stumbled, and his phone tumbled from his jacket pocket. With a grunt, he snatched it from the ground, checked the screen, and tossed the phone in the back seat. Charles opened the hatchback and stumbled out. He placed both hands in the small of his back and grimaced as his spine popped. "You okay, buddy?" Danny asked, patting him on the shoulder. "I'm only glad I'm out now. Next time you're riding in the back. Jesus Christ, my back is stiff." "Language," Kate said, walking past. "Sorry, dear," Charles said quietly. "Yeah," Danny said with a giggle. "Sorry, dear." Alvin stood in front of a metal gate that was 7 feet high. In between the horizontal bars was a heavy metal mesh that twinkled in the glow of the headlights. He looked to either side and found there was also a fence just as tall as the gate that was also comprised of the same mesh running in either direction. Alvin looked around for any signs that would explain why this area was gated off, but found nothing. Charles came to stand by him and look at the strange gate as well. "Well, this is weird," he said, fiddling with the heavy lock that secured the gate. "This is the road," Sharon said. "Yeah," Alvin said quietly. "I don't remember this gate or this fence, though. Charles? Kate?" They both shook their heads, and Kate answered, "We haven't been out this way in years, really, except driving through. We come here to watch the fireworks shows, but that's on the opposite side." "Hey, everyone, come down here," Danny called. They all turned and walked down the fence line to where Danny was kneeling with the 2 coolers of beer on either side of him. He was pressing against a section of the fence, about 5 feet off the ground, that had split open. Judging from the damage around the split, it looked like someone had hit the fence hard, but not hard enough to prevent them from leaving the scene. He pressed harder on the damaged section until the split went all the way to the ground and was about 2 feet wide. Before anyone could object, he had pushed through the gap and pulled the 2 coolers in with him. Wait a second, Danny. I don't know. We should probably find someplace else," Alvin said, leaning with one hand on the fence. In the heavy darkness on the other side of the fence, only parts of Danny could be seen. Patches of him were highlighted by moonlight. He set one foot on the cooler, leaned on his knee, and said, "Come on, buddy. If we go somewhere else, then we kind of lose the point of this." "I'm pretty sure that we would be trespassing," Charles said. "We trespassed all the time as kids," Danny fired back. "True, but when you're a kid trespassing and cops show up, they just run you off or call your parents. When you're an adult, they arrest you," Maggie said, placing her hands on her hips. "Oh, we'll be fine. This whole place is fenced off now, and even when it wasn't, no one ever came down to box," Danny said. He then grabbed the handle of each cooler and willingly gave himself to the darkness. "Besides, if anything happens, we have a big-shot lawyer on our side," his voice called back. "I do inheritance and tax law mostly," Sharon called as she slipped through the gap. Charles looked over at Alvin, who shrugged and gestured in a "you first" motion towards the fence. Charles took Kate by the hand and held the fence open as he guided her through before following. Maggie then gingerly stepped through and looked back at Alvin. "You coming?" Alvin nodded, and Maggie turned and with a stumbling jog followed the rest. Alvin tested the gap and then stepped towards the fence. He stopped when his foot caught on something on the ground. He looked back and saw the corner of what he could only guess to be a thick metal sign or plate lying face down among a snarl of thick leaves and grass. He turned away from the fence and bent down. He wrapped the fingers of his right hand around the corner of the sign and used his left to steady himself by pressing it flat on the ground. Just as he began to lift the sign, he felt a tickle that was soft but with definite weight on the back of his left hand. He glanced over, and illuminated by the still glowing taillights of the Jeep, he saw a wolf spider the size of a coaster resting on the back of his hand. Goosebumps exploded across his body as his eyes widened in shock. He took in a sudden gasp of breath and flung his hand wildly in the air. He flicked his hand rapidly up and down as if frantically waving away a bee. As he did, he stumbled backwards against the fence. In the red lights, he saw the silhouette of the spider still flying in the air. The arachnid's alien legs spasmed wildly for purchase before vanishing into the dark and landing with a small rustle. He heard a panicked but small shifting of underbrush as the spider fled from the scene. Alvin shuddered again at the sound and shook off the invisible spiders he could still feel. Now calmed, he rubbed at the back of his hand and turned towards the gap. He took a final look down at the sign, shook his head, and stepped through the fence. During the brief hike, they had all talked about the different times they had all come out to Buck's Point, either as a group or separate. Soon they all fell into their usual roles in the group, even speaking in the same taking turns way that they had so long ago. Alvin revelled in this, as they all did. The only thing souring the whole experience was an odour that seemed to follow them wherever they went. They had all noticed it and mentioned it in one way or another. Maggie had managed to describe it better than all of them. "It's decay," she had said in a cheery way that clashed violently with her words. "There is another smell with it, like flowers blooming, but a bunch of different ones. But I do smell a lot of dead animals." "Could there be like a wolf or whatever running around here?" Kate asked quietly. "Oh, no," Maggie said with a laugh. "I mean, it is possible, but not likely. There could be a ton of reasons that there are a few dead animals here. It might not even be that many. Could just be a big deer somewhere upwind." Despite her assurances, they were quiet the rest of the walk there. When they found the clearing, Alvin noticed that the circular patch that overlooked a secluded section of shore seemed much smaller than he remembered. He looked around and was certain the clearing had become smaller, and it was not the distortion of memory. There were a few large stones that he could remember sitting on that he did not recall being as close to the edge of the clearing as they were now. Danny came up, ending his thoughts about the clearing by dropping the 2 coolers on the ground. "Grab one, buddy. I feel like my fucking arm's about to fall off." Danny rubbed at his right shoulder. Alvin bent to one side and lifted one of the coolers up by the handle and joined his old friend in carrying them down the rest of the way. Charles pulled a thick log from a tangle of weeds by the shore. "Baby, our bench is still here," he called to Kate as he dragged it out. Kate laughed and sat next to her husband on the log. Sharon and Maggie found 2 large rocks and rolled them across from the couple, while Alvin and Danny positioned the coolers to where they could sit facing the shore. Before sitting down, they grabbed beers from the ice inside and tossed one to each of their friends. "Dark as hell out here," Danny complained softly. The moon was giving plenty of light, but he never cared for the dark. Sharon stood from her rock and headed over to the coolers. From the back of each one she removed an LED lantern that had been resting in a cutout of the case. She pulled the tops of each lantern, exposing the lights inside. She then flicked a small switch on top, and the circle of friends were bathed in a soft white glow. Smiling, she set them down and stood proudly before Danny, who applauded like a child at a magic show. She laughed and gave a quick bow. "Looks and brains is a very dangerous package," he said. "Great power and all that. That's why I was born so handsome, but left with only enough intelligence to hire those who know more than me. Can't trust me with both." "That right there," Sharon said, walking back to her spot, "tells me something that I've always believed about you. You possess something that I say is just as important as intelligence. Wisdom." "Holy shit," Danny said with a chuckle. "I've never been called wise before." As time went on, the friends drank, talked, and laughed. Maggie had caught them up on her life with her Trevor and their plans to adopt their first child. Sharon went on for several minutes on her love for Chicago, her divorce, and the law firm she worked at. Danny kept them all laughing with various jokes interjected and stories that he swore were true about running not only one dispensary but a full chain of them now. Charles and Kate sat with hands held and told how the bookstore that they had opened 4 years earlier had grown enough that it was now their main employment, and how they were trying to have their first baby and would be seeing a doctor the following week. "It'll be just to make sure nothing is wrong," she said happily and kissed Charles on the cheek. Alvin was the quietest of them all. He was enjoying listening to his friends' lives and storing certain details away to change slightly and use for possible future projects. He already knew the basics of what everyone was saying through the different social media formats they used, but hearing the stories being told was different. Through status updates, you couldn't really hear the emotion behind what was being told. He realized, listening to them, that we all too often sum up our lives in status updates, and people were losing the substance or the spirit of the lives of the people they knew. "What about you, Alvin? Do you have any stories about famous people?" Danny asked, nudging him. "Why would I have any stories about famous people?" "Because you're a famous writer," Maggie said loudly. "I'm famous to those who know writers, and even then I would put myself at the B or C level." He laughed and said, "It's not the same as like an actor or a singer or whatever. I have met the occasional actor, usually on my way to or from something, but nothing too interesting." Speaking of famous, what was the name of that band? Charles asked, laughing. That you were going to start, Danny. You were going to be famous, remember? Danny hung his head in shame and said, Dream Tears. Everyone broke out in snickers at the name, Danny included. Hey, he said, pointing to Charles. Charles wouldn't come in with me with his bass, so if he had, things might have been different. I am glad the dream is dead, or rather the Dream Tears is dead. Danny looked up at the starlit sky and poured out a drink for his dead band, and said, And things go on. What's that? Asked Alvin. Something my dad used to say. He told me after Mom died that we think our lives are all there is to life, when there is a larger life that we are all part of. When she died, her life ended, but things go on. The larger life moves forward with us, and we take her with us. And when we go, we are taken by others who take us with them, and so on. I didn't know that, Sharon said. About what your father said? Well, that's because I never told anyone, Danny said with a soft smile. He then slapped his hands together and said, Fuck me for bringing the conversation down, and fuck all of you for letting it happen. He then asked, Remember that raccoon that came at Kate when we were out here on graduation night? Everyone let loose with waves of laughter. Kate blushed and buried her head in Charles's shoulder, forcing him to laugh even harder and throw an arm around her. She thought it was going to eat her, Alvin said through his laughter. She ran and jumped in the pond. It was going to attack me, Kate said. You all saw it. I saw a raccoon that was interested in the food we all had, Maggie said. Well, I just hope we don't see any tonight. Raccoon have always given me the creeps ever since. She then took a nervous look around. None of you have seen any, have you? Alvin frowned in thought, looked at the dark trees around them and said, Actually, I haven't seen or heard anything all night. I mean, no animals at all. Isn't that weird? Yeah, Maggie agreed. On a spring night, a place like this is usually crawling with all sorts of nocturnal animals. Well, Danny said, standing, I wouldn't worry about it. He then tossed his empty bottle on the small pile in the center. I'm going to go take a piss. Danny then left the ring of white light and was soon gone in the darkness. The group had fallen silent, and Maggie looked around with great curiosity. She had become extremely aware of the silence that enveloped them. In her mind's eye, she replayed their walk from the split in the fence, down the narrow road, and to their secret clearing. She realized that they had not seen nor heard any animals, and only a few nocturnal insects. She could not remember spotting a single deer, raccoon, possum, squirrel, or hearing any birds in the trees. She then discovered that she no longer wanted to be there. She wanted to leave this quiet and dark place. She was just about to speak up when Danny's voice interrupted her from the darkness behind them. Hey, Alvin, Danny called. Come take a look at this. Look at what? Alvin shouted back. Stop making me yell and just come look at this. Alvin set his beer down in a small drink holder he had dug in the dirt with his heel and left the light. Maggie bit her lip to prevent the escape of words. She decided to just wait until he got back and then ask everyone to pack up and leave. Alvin had thought he would use his phone's flashlight, but was happy to see there was enough moon and starlight that once his eyes adjusted, he was able to make his way through the trees and bushes. He soon saw his friend's back silhouetted in the dim light. He was standing very still and looking down at the base of a large oak tree that had at one time split into almost 2 different trees. He stood next to Danny and looked down at the spot that Danny was silently pointing to. He needed his flashlight this time to see exactly what he was being asked to see, but he did not need the light to smell what he suspected he was about to see. He tapped the screen and a sharp beam of light projected out from his phone. Shining the light down revealed the most primal blend of beauty and carnage he had ever seen with his own eyes. He was looking at a plant. That much was for certain. It was large, standing about 3 feet tall at its highest point. It was composed of a single thick leaf like one you might see on a succulent. The edges were a deep forest green that evenly faded into a pale yellow the deeper you looked down into the pitcher-shaped plant. But down is also where the horrors were. Deep in the bottom of the plant, what was once a small possum gazed upward in a forever and silent death scream. The flesh around the face had begun to ooze and drip, revealing the skull underneath. The long, narrow nose was a wet and soggy mass of flesh, covered with what looked like bile to Alvin and Danny. "What the fuck?" Alvin whispered to no one. "Looks like it didn't agree with something much bigger," Danny said. He looked and could see Alvin's confused expression. "Maybe something ate it, and then, I don't know, got sick and threw it up here." "What the fuck around here could swallow a fucking possum whole?" "I don't know, but I'm starting to think we are seeing the reason why things are so damn quiet around here. I don't really want to hang around to be silenced myself." Alvin nodded in firm agreement and turned, pulling Danny by the elbow with him. They tried to move quickly from the tree, but found the ground had become soft as they had discussed the fate of the possum. They had travelled less than 3 feet before Danny stumbled and came down sharp to his left. Alvin heard a muffled pop, quickly followed by a painful moan. "Oh, my fucking ankle," Danny said through clenched teeth. "It's done this before. I just rolled it." Danny lifted himself from the ground and rested on his knees. He looked at his palm and saw it was covered in a clear but sticky gel, much like pure aloe. It shimmered in the moonlight. He quickly dragged his palm down his black jeans, removing some of the material. He looked down and realized the gel had come from the thick leaves he was kneeling in. The leaves oozed the clear gel with pressure. They were the same green to yellow coloring as the plant at the base of the tree. "Hell," Danny said slowly. "Help me up, bud. My ankle is fine. Just rolled it, I think. Let's get out of here." Alvin grabbed his friend by his right bicep and began to gently ease him up, but found it difficult. He tried harder and grunted. "Hey, man," he said with a chuckle. "I know it hurts, but help?" "I'm trying," Danny said, with panic quickly raising in his voice. "It's the fucking plants! I'm stuck!" Alvin reached around and grabbed Danny under both arms, but discovered it difficult to move his own feet. It was as if he had been standing still in firm clay mud that was now starting to set. He grunted and pulled his left leg up with a burst of energy. His foot came up, bringing with it a swatch of the thick leaves and throwing his center of gravity off, sending him tumbling to his right. His legs kicked up and he left his right shoe behind as he tumbled over Danny. "Alvin!" Danny called as he saw his friend fall hard to the ground and roll towards the tree. Taking great care to control his balance, Danny forced himself to his feet. Long strands of the gel stretched from the knees of his pants to the ground. He turned and moved to Alan, the ground causing him to lift his feet high and step in broad stomps. He looked like a man who was having to walk through deep snow and is not used to doing so. Alvin had hit the tree as he fell and rolled past it. He was now struggling to stand just on the other side. He was no longer on the thick leaves, but was covered almost completely in the sticky substance. Leaves, dirt, and grass stuck to him as he struggled to his feet. Danny rushed over as he realized Alvin was struggling to breathe. Alvin was clawing at his face, desperate to peel the goo away. Danny pulled a blue bandana from his jacket pocket and helped Alvin clear his nose and mouth. Alvin sucked in a deep and greedy breath as Danny then worked on clearing his eyes. "Tony?" Alvin said, his words starting to slur. "I don't feel..." He stumbled, and Danny caught him, trying his best to keep the apparently toxic goop off him. "I'll put it up, Megan," Alvin said wildly, "as soon as the rain stops." His voice trailed off like a person falling to sleep. Danny pulled Alvin along, who seemed aware enough to move his legs with Danny. He tried to guide them around the patch of sticky leaves, but Alvin thrashed against him. "Don't touch that," he commanded to a phantom and pulled from Danny's grip. Danny had to brace himself against a near tree as he watched Alvin fall back towards the patch of strange leaves. He fell, and more of the aloe-like substance oozed, coating his clothes. Danny grabbed onto a low branch and reached out to grab Alvin by the wrist when Alvin slid away from him. Danny pulled his hand back in that instinctive way you do when seeing unexpected movement. Alvin continued to slide away from Danny, and both of his legs fell below the surface of the grass. It was then Danny realized that his dazed friend was sliding into a larger version of the pitcher-shaped plant nestled in a patch of tall grass at the base of a much larger tree across from the other. Danny saw when he had first entered the small circle to relieve himself that he had stepped within inches of that opening. He pulled himself away as Alvin slid deeper and deeper into the basin. The edges of the plant moved slowly, and Alvin began to squirm in reaction. Seeing the plant on a much larger scale showed Danny that it was shaped much like the paper cone snack foods come in at large festivals, and the cone was tightening. Alvin started to thrash in the confines of the cone that now held him with the loving embrace of a boa constrictor. Danny's eyes swelled in terror, and he covered his mouth with his free hand at the muffled snaps and pops of Alvin's ribs breaking. Alvin's head moved violently from side to side. His eyes sprang open, and his chin dropped down, twisting his face into a silent scream. Blood trickled from his nose, and then from his eyes. Danny stood, petrified against the tree, the pain in his ankle no longer registering in his shattered thoughts, nor the sensation of warm urine running down his leg, for that matter. Danny's eyes welled with hot tears as he heard a final, low pop. Alvin's body jumped as much as it could, once, twice. Then his eyes, still pushed almost to the limit from their sockets, glazed over mercifully into the unseeing stare of the dead. "What the hell happened?" Charles asked, straining to keep the panic out of his voice. "Where's Alvin?" Sharon asked. They were all standing at the edge of the clearing. They had heard the yells from just earlier and were on their way to investigate when Danny had come stumbling into the light. He had begun to look worse. His left hand had turned an alarming shade of red, and the fingers appeared to be swelling. He was holding the hand to his chest and leaning against a tree. He was taking hard breaths as if the small distance had winded him. "It was a plant or something," Danny said through gasping breaths. The plants, they took him. He's dead. We need to go and get someone. It was this plant. Oh, fuck. Oh, Christ. What? I don't... Sharon's words trailed off when Danny looked at her with wild eyes. She then shook her head and said, I'm going to go find Alvin. Before anyone could stop her, she had pushed past Danny and vanished in the darkness. Danny reached out for her but leaned on his hurt leg and let out a hiss of pain. He then said, We have to get her. She has the fucking keys. Danny then turned away from them and limped after Sharon. Charles and Kate looked at each other, then both decided to go after their friends, closely followed by Maggie, whose arms were now crossed as she glanced around. Danny tried to push the pain out of his mind as he caught up to Sharon, who was walking slowly and calling out Alvin's name. He was starting to feel weak, and the skin on his left hand was burning with a relentlessness that was threatening to drive him mad. You don't get it, Sharon, he said through the pain. We have to leave. Shit's sake, you're not even going the right way. Danny gestured around them with his good hand and quickly brought it back to cradle its mate. Sharon stepped back and leaned against a thin tree. The low branches blocked the moonlight, causing her face and most of her torso to be hidden behind a shadow. Behind Danny, the rest stepped out from their own shadows. Where's Alvin? Kate asked, looking around. He's dead, Danny said quickly. He then turned to Sharon and said, Look at my hand. He held it out to her and slowly moved it around. The skin had become a deep purple. It looked black in the moonlight. It would have looked to Maggie like the advanced stages of frostbite if it wasn't for the horrible boils that had come up, making it seem more like an allergic reaction. Kate gasped at the sight of the hand, and Danny could hear Charles swear quietly. This time, Kate let the swear go by, unnoticed. Danny could not tell if the sight of his ruined hand had any effect on Sharon's opinion. Her face was still hidden behind the mask of shadow, and she did not try to look closer. What happened? Maggie asked. I don't know. There were these leaves on the ground, thick ones like a cactus or whatever. Fuck, I don't know plants. He hissed in pain and brought his hand back to his chest. They oozed this sticky shit, and we fell in it, and it did this to my hand. But Alvin, he got the worse. He trailed off before looking back in Sharon's direction. Let's just go. You got the keys, so let's bolt. They all looked in Sharon's direction, but she did not speak or make any indication she had heard or even cared what Danny had been saying. No one spoke, but Danny took a cautious step closer. She still did not speak, but he could hear a sound like air escaping from the hole in a balloon. He quickly reached out with his uninjured hand and grabbed the bottom of Sharon's shirt. His heart pounded in his chest, numbing the pain of his injuries and blinding him to the sensation of warm droplets that had dropped on the back of his hand. When he pulled her from the shadows, she had fallen forward rather than stepped. But she was not dead. Yet. Her eyes had rolled back in her head, showing only the whites. Twin streams of blood ran from her nostrils, soaking her mouth and chin. Her entire body vibrated as if she had been connected to a wire running a low current. White foam was building in the corners of her quivering mouth. It mixed with the dark blood, creating a color that was terribly cheery. The front of her shirt was quickly turning a dark shade with blood from a new source. Danny looked down at her throat and could see a red vine, the thickness of a backyard water hose, draped around her neck like a scarf, with the remainder snaking up through the branches. Danny's hand dropped from her shirt, and he brought the hand instinctively towards the vine to pull it away from his friend, then stopped. The vine was covered in a coating of stubby yellow stems, topped with red bulbs. Each one oozed a cloudy material that clung to everything it touched. The vine did not appear to be wrapped around her neck. Rather, it was against her, as if it had simply fallen, but now was fastened to her by the ooze. Why was she bleeding?
"What the fuck is that?"
Charles said in a high and panicked voice.
"We have to get it off her."
Before Danny could stop him, Charles stepped from his wife and grabbed the vine hard with his right hand, just above Sharon's ear. The scream that Charles emitted was unlike any noise produced by a person that those remaining had ever heard. Danny stepped back in terror as Charles pulled violently against the vine. Blood ran from his open palm as he pulled, harder, pulling Sharon with him in his panic. Kate tried to grab her husband by the shoulders and calm him, but was only able to slow his thrashes. As he jerked with the wild frenzy of a trapped animal, Sharon danced like a puppet, and the branches above them shook and moved. Around them, leaves rained down as if fall had come early. Danny grabbed his friend's wrist, taking great care not to touch any of the vine. Charles's entire hand was now encased in the sticky ooze. Blood poured freely from the hand, soaking the arm of his jacket and the front of his shirt. Danny twisted Charles's arm and could see 4 large black thorns protruding through the back of Charles's hand. He quickly flicked his eyes towards Sharon and could see countless more of the black thorns coming from the small red bulbs and pushing deep into her flesh.
"It burns!"
Charles yelled, now delirious. Danny could see Charles's arm rapidly swelling, now looking like a multicolored sausage, already tight against his clothes. Danny held on to Charles and looked over at Sharon, whose face was swelling with the same frightening speed. Then Danny's vision went white with searing pain. He heard the wet crunch of his nose breaking as Charles's elbow connected. Danny tumbled back, the taste of blood filling his mouth and peppering the back of his throat. He brought his hands up to his face, cupping his shattered nose. His vision blurred and distorted, mercifully keeping him from seeing the hellscape that surrounded him. As Danny had fallen back into the ground, the end of the vine that had been hanging just behind Sharon's shoulder had now swung around and wrapped her neck. Charles, still in his panic, spun around, pulling Sharon violently by the neck with him. The vine around Sharon's neck coiled tighter in the maelstrom, the dark thorns cutting deeper. Charles reached up with his free hand and grabbed the vine. His grip released more of the glue and released a new set of thorns through this other hand. Fresh blood flowed from his new wounds. He threw his head back and wailed again, the back of his head connecting with his wife's face, sending her stumbling back towards the tree. Charles used his remaining strength for one hard pull in a savage attempt to free himself from the snare. The loop around Sharon's neck tightened even more. The flesh surrounding the vine and thorns began to tear, creating a gap that unleashed a rooster-tail fountain of blood that jetted up through the low branches. Though he still could not see, Danny could hear the rain-like sound of the blood coming back down, followed by Maggie's screams. The smell of metal filled the air. Charles continued his frenzied pull against the vine. The loop around Sharon continued its bloody trek through the remainder of her neck. Finally, Sharon's head fell from her shoulders and landed in the damp grass with a quiet thud. The night was silent again, with the exception of the still dripping blood and Maggie's breathing. Danny's vision finally cleared. He got to one knee and surveyed the carnage that surrounded him. His hand burned and throbbed. The pain in his ankle was minor compared to the rest of his injuries, but was still there. He struggled to get air through his smashed nose and had to settle for breathing through his blood-stained mouth. All of that fell away from his mind once he was able to understand the scene in front of him. Sharon's body remained on her knees, her head resting on the ground only a foot from her. His stomach turned at the sight of the swollen and bloodied face staring unseeing towards him. He looked past Sharon and saw Charles hanging lifelessly by his arms. The vine that was around Sharon now stuck and partially wrapped around his right leg. Further behind him, Danny could see Kate's legs stretching out from under the shadow of the tree, the rest of her hidden in darkness. Danny looked over at Maggie, who was now hyperventilating. "No," she said so low Danny wasn't sure he had heard. "No," she said louder. "Maggie," Danny said with a groan as he stood. We need to get out of here!" Maggie shouted. Danny stumbled towards her and reached out for her, but a sound caused him to stop and slowly turn towards the tree. From close to Kate, a low rustling could be heard, like a snake passing through green grass. It only lasted a moment, leaving silence behind. Danny turned to speak to Maggie when the sound happened again. He turned further towards the sound, favoring his good ankle as he did. The sound had not gone away as he had thought, but had only fallen below his perception. He could hear it as it moved a larger cluster of grass in the shadows. "Fuck this," Maggie whispered, turned and ran. She was gone before Danny could look back. He reached for her, but knew that was futile. Her form had already become one with the shadows around them, and the sound of her frantic running quickly faded. "Maggie!" Danny shouted for her. "For fuck's sake, that's the wrong fucking way!" He screamed with more desperation than fear or rage. He didn't know where she was going, and he was certain that she did not know either. Maggie's mind was no longer one with her actions. The logic that normally dictated her actions, the logic that she would lean on to get her through any problem, had failed. The strain of the recent horror was simply more than it could bear. When she called on logic during her aimless sprint, only the memory of Sharon's head falling from her shoulders, the sound it made when it hit the ground, and the panicked screams from Charles came to mind. Her breath came in ragged and burning bursts from her mouth. Her ears thudded with her racing heart muffling the sound of Danny's shouts. She thought of Trevor and wanted nothing more than for him to be with her and to hear him say that it would all be okay. His face in her mind's eye weakened the cloud of fear that infested her thoughts and held her logic at bay. It was now working at a limited capacity, but working enough to make her stop her run and rest with her hands on her knees. Still shaking, she realized her phone was in her back pocket. She could call for help. Not Trevor, Oklahoma City was over 2 hours away, but a cop at least. She nervously checked around her before she reached back and removed her phone from its place. She unlocked the phone and repeatedly pressed the small icon at the bottom of the screen. Her hands were damp from sweat and the humidity, causing the screen to misread her inputs. She grunted in frustration as the phone slipped from her grasp and fell to the ground. Maggie dropped to her knees and felt for her phone. It was then she realized that she had been standing in a large patch of white flowers. Each flower was the diameter of a baseball, with thick, soft petals and large yellow centers. Briefly, she thought of the daisies her father would bring her as a girl. These were much larger and hugged the ground, hindering her ability to locate her phone. She dragged her hands through the patch, but stopped when she caught movement from the corner of her vision. She slowly turned and saw, almost glowing in the silver moonlight, one of the flowers turning towards her. It was not a quick turn, but done with such deliberateness that she knew it had not been the wind or her imagination. She was then surrounded with a sweet floral scent, like honeysuckle and roses. The smell was intoxicating, and she found herself calming down, her adrenaline-fueled shakes now slowing. She stared at the flower and felt the overpowering urge to smell it. She leaned forward, her logic and recent memories numbed by the odor. Then the flower twitched, and a yellow cloud of pollen peppered her face. Maggie jerked back and got to her feet. She began to wipe at her face with both hands, trying to clear the dust, when her eyes began to burn. She looked around but discovered she could not see. The world had become a dark swirl of color. Then her nose and mouth joined in with their own burning. The pain grew worse, and Maggie clawed at her face, trying to remove whatever had been sprayed on her, each swipe of her hand leaving behind yellow streaks. With each passing second, the pain grew worse, and her attempts to clear her face became more frantic. Her nails soon began to dig bloody trenches in her skin as she lost all self-control. Her throat then began to close, forcing her to struggle for breath. She wheezed as she stumbled around the patch, attempting to scream and clutching at her swelling throat as if fighting off an invisible strangler. She felt the crunch of her phone screen under her boot heel, but paid little attention. She was losing contact with the world around her at an alarming rate. Then, every muscle in her body tensed at once, the cord standing out on her neck, and she fell straight back onto the flower bed. A thick cloud of yellow dust puffed up and then gently settled back down on top of her. Danny did not need to get closer to the tree to deduce the source of the sound. Leaves above Charles shook with renewed movement, and he saw a new red vine drop down onto Charles. He was now certain that the noise in the grass was another terrible vine wrapping around Kate. "Kate!" Danny called out and waited for a reply. He watched her feet and waited for any sign of life. He heard more movement under the tree and knew she would never reply. She was being wrapped looked like Sharon and Charles. He looked at his hand and saw the skin was now completely black. He knew what was happening to his hand, to Alvin and to his other friends. They were being consumed. Suddenly, Danny felt very vulnerable, like an insect caught in a trap. He needed to leave, to get to the jeep and to get to his phone. He looked back at Sharon's body, and a horrible reminder slithered through his mind. She has the keys. A shudder rocked his aching body when he thought of feeling through her pockets for the rental keys. He thought back and prayed that she had brought a purse or a bag, but knew that she had not. Other than the cooler, they had all only brought what they had on them. He took a cautious step forward and scanned the branches above him. He took another step and looked at Sharon's body, still on her knees like an obscene statue. He took another step, but was greeted with more rustling noises. Fear took hold of him, and he shook his head at the thought of getting any closer. "Fuck this noise," he said to no one. With a heart filled with terror and sorrow, he turned and continued to limp as fast as he could towards the gravel road they had walked down before cutting through the trees to their clearing. As he did, he repeatedly looked over his shoulder and expected to see the trees themselves charging after him. Then he heard what, at that moment, was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He heard the crunch of gravel under his feet. He looked down and could see the lines that the coolers had created while being dragged earlier, and knew what direction to go. Smiling, he limped down the gravel path. It wasn't long before he saw the bend in the path they had encountered when they first came through the trees. He looked and could see snatches of the jeep glinting in the moonlight. A smile exploded on his face when he also saw the split in the mesh fencing they had come through. "Thank you, God," he said, and pushed through the low branches. He pressed the gap in the fence and carefully worked his hurt leg through. Then, as he tried to pull his other leg through, he found it stuck to the ground. His body surged with horror as he looked back and saw his leg wrapped in vines with large, flat, green leaves. The vine gave a violent tug, pulling back through the gap. He landed face down on the ground and immediately began scrambling towards the opening. He wriggled through the gap like a worm, but was stopped halfway through by another hard tug. He reached out for anything to help and found the metal edge of something. He reached with his destroyed hand and attempted to grip it. He cried out in pain. With all his remaining strength, he pulled himself forward, using the metal object. His body slowly slid forwards, and he could feel the vines tighten around his leg. He then felt something snake around his hurt ankle, and up until it wrapped around his thigh with a terrifying determination and crushing force. Danny screamed in pain and tightened his grip on the metal object. From under his shirt, he could feel more of the vines drag their way up, small thorns cutting bloody slits in his flesh as they traveled. Danny gritted his teeth and pulled even harder. He felt the thorns dig into his shoulders and chest as they became warm and wet with fresh blood. Danny took one final look up at the moon and realized he was out of strength. With a final tug, Danny shot back through the gap, flipping the metal sign up on end and blocking the split. If anyone had been there, they would have heard his screams shrink as he was pulled back to whatever fate awaited him. When he was consoling his son after the death of his wife, Danny's father had told him that things go on. And he was right. The next day, a park ranger discovered the abandoned jeep and the metal sign that was still leaning against the fence. The ranger angled his back to read at the crooked angle. The sign read, "Attention, federal property. No trespassing. Not responsible for injuries or death. Violators will be prosecuted. This site is controlled by the Department for Evolving Defenses." After discovering the break in the fence, the ranger placed a call to the DED and notified them of the fallen sign and fence damage. In less than 6 hours, DED agents arrived at the scene, towed the jeep, repaired the sign and the break in the fence. While one of the agents installed a simple white security camera, the one who only identified himself to the ranger as agent in charge thanked the ranger for his duty. While shaking the ranger's hand, the agent in charge said, "I assure you the area has been completely swept, and we found no signs that anyone had been in there. I doubt that anyone even knew the break was there, with the sign blocking it." And things go on. Insectivorous by Joe Palumbo. If that story enraged you, we suggest you sit down and enjoy a lovely green salad. You'll feel much better afterwards. FYI, gentle listener, we have another of Mr. Palumbo's stories available for your listening pleasure. Just pop back to episode 35, in which we featured his rather ominously titled tale, The Gravesman. All right, let's vegetate no longer. It's time to make like a tree and leave, as they say. This episode was brought to you with the generous assistance of our Patreon subscribers, our dedicated minions, our beloved acolytes, and of course our most esteemed cohorts. Cohorts, you are the black wind beneath our veined parchment wings. Evan Dooley, Rachel Brown, Stephanie Saloka, Michael Wood, Joe Stinson, Alex Brewis, Alicia Townsend, Barry Jones, J.B., Sam Bell, Abaddon, Eugene Petrie, Adam, Arnie Frank, Robert Troy Hampton Peterson, Wayne Prince, Shell, Stephen Andrews, and our newest cohort, Tippy Polo. And there I was thinking that name was strictly for the birds. It would appear not. By the way, Tippy, in case you weren't aware, a new episode of A Voice from Darkness has dropped only recently. I suggest you check your national alerts immediately, if you haven't already done so. Also, I seem to recall there was a very interesting guest on the call-in segment this time around, although I can't for the life of me remember who it was. How strange. For any uninitiated out there, A Voice from Darkness is a podcast where you can hear radio broadcaster and parapsychologist Dr. Malcolm Ryder as he helps callers with their supernatural problems. And don't we all have those, gentle listener? Spawned from the inimitable imagination of Jack Reese, and featuring our own humble narrator as Dr. Malcolm Ryder, it provides you yet another lovely manner in which to get your creeps, and stay abreast of supernatural developments as they occur. Stay informed, stay safe, just like Tippy. All non-public domain stories are featured with the permission of the authors. All voices and production are concocted by Kristin Holland. Until next time, as always, watch the skies, fear the dark, and don't trust anyone, especially yourself. Good night, gentle listener.